Thanks for joining us tonight here at Casa Italiana, this pretty fantastic space on the Columbia campus. Many of you, I think, regularly come to Center on Global Energy Policy events, but I'll just introduce myself again. I'm Jason Bordoff, a professor at the School of International Public Affairs, and I direct the Center on Global Energy Policy, and really delighted to have you all here and have such a distinguished panel to help us talk about a pretty timely issue in global energy markets right now, especially with the oil price collapse of the last couple of years. There's been much discussion about what's going to happen to U.S. shale, much discussion about what's going to happen to OPEC oil policy and OPEC supply. I think not always enough attention on what's going to happen to non-OPEC, non-shale supply, and much of that is focused on offshore resources around the world. That includes the Gulf of Mexico, where about a fifth of U.S. oil production comes from, Brazil, the North Sea, and other places. About a third of the world's oil and gas comes from offshore resources. And this is happening at a time when you're also seeing increased activity in the offshore for renewable energy. And one of the companies that's taking a leadership role, including down the street in Long Island, is Statoil, that's represented here this evening. And more questions raised about the future of oil demand, about investments in sources of oil supply that often, not always, can be considered higher cost. And relevant to the gas market, too. A lot of sources of major offshore gas reserves around the world, in East Africa and elsewhere, and also a region that Statoil knows well. So we're going to talk about many of those things tonight. First, let me say that this event, like all of those at the center, is being webcast live for the many people watching online. Full video and podcast recording of the event will be made available on our website and on iTunes in the coming days. For those, we'll have a discussion with the panelists, and then we'll turn to the audience for questions. Those watching online can ask questions as well through the hashtag CGEP events at our Twitter handle at ColumbiaU Energy. So we have, as I said, a pretty great lineup of speakers to help us understand this issue tonight. Lars Bacher is the Executive Vice President of Development and Production International at Statoil. He's been with the company for, I don't want to say how many years, because maybe that'll make you feel bad, but many years. And really, I mean, I will say so many years that he has seen Statoil change a lot from a relatively small national oil company focused on developing Norway's offshore resources to a truly global, publicly listed energy company, one of the largest oil and gas companies in the world, with production activities all over the world. And as I said, just including offshore wind here in New York State. And we want to welcome you to New York and wish you good luck in the marathon this weekend. Tommy Beaudreau was a colleague of mine in the U.S. government, is now a partner at Latham and Watkins. He was the Chief of Staff at the Interior Department and also the first director of the Bureau of Ocean Energy Management, which is responsible for managing the U.S. offshore resources, developing the government's 5-year leasing plan, conducting lease sales for oil and gas as well as renewables. Antoine Halff is a senior research scholar at the Center on Global Energy Policy and directs our global oil market program, has many years of experience in the public and private sector, including most recently as head of the oil market division at the International Energy Agency in Paris. Amy Jaffe, we're delighted to welcome you. Join us here tonight and also join us in New York City, having just recently become the David Rubenstein Senior Fellow for Energy and the Environment at the Council on Foreign Relations. And many of you know Amy, a leading expert on many aspects of global energy policy and geopolitics and sustainability at places like the University of California, Davis, and at Rice University, and in many other capacities. And then Adrián Lajous, we're always honored as a fellow at the Center on Global Energy Policy and was formerly the CEO of Pemex for many years. So we're going to have a conversation with this great panel. And first, I'm going to ask Lars to say a few words and provide a little bit of an overview about what his company is doing, and then ask everyone, so you guys can stay where you are now so you can see the slides here. Hopefully everyone can see that. And then we'll ask our panelists to come up and join me on these bar stools, and we'll have a conversation before opening it up to questions from the audience. Lars, let me turn it over to you.
Thank you. And thank you for the kind introduction, and also thank you for this opportunity to speak to you on such an important topic. At least I feel it's a very important topic, and I'm not shy to say that I've been working for this company for 26 years. Also very nice to be part of such a distinguished panel. Well, the last couple of years, it's been a lot about drop in oil price, but also the shale revolution in the US. And we also have taken part in that shale revolution by taking positions in a couple of the assets, including Bacher, Eagle Ford, and Marcellus. And yes, we are exporting gas to Manhattan as part of a pipeline we took a position in a couple of years ago. But what perhaps is not that visible to that many, partly perhaps also because of the distance, is what is happening offshore. And to me, that is as exciting as the shale revolution. And before I go into details about that, I would like to just tell you a little bit about the company. And then move a little bit on this stuff first, like this. So, next slide, please. So the purpose of Statoil is to turn natural resources into energy for people and progress for society. We were founded in 1972 on the idea that resource development done by skillful workers could provide value for society. And it started out as a 100% state-owned company. And then in 2001, we became a public listed company on the Oslo Stock Exchange and also here in New York, Manhattan. Next slide, please. And we are saying that we would like to shape the future of energy. That is our vision. And for us, that's about 3 pillars. One is competitive at all times. And we have used this downturn in the oil price to actually restructure the company and the way we're thinking internally. And I will come back to some of the details later. But this is based on the principle, basic assumption that being low on the development curve and also low on the cost curve, then you will prevail as a company. Then it is the transformation of oil and gas industry as such. That is partly, the composition of oil and gas around the world and composition of our own portfolio in many ways. But also because we believe that the Paris Agreement and the 2-degree scenario is here to stay in many ways. We, as a company, are not disputing the science behind the global warming. And whatever we do internally in the company is to make sure that our composition of the portfolio and our business, that we can contribute to the world delivering on the 2-degree scenario that were agreed upon in Paris. And then it is the third pillar. And when you look at our portfolio today, when it comes to emissions of CO2, we are averaging 10 kilograms of CO2 per barrel produced. The world average is 18. And we have a roadmap established internally to take us to 2030 and then bring it down from 10 kilograms to 8 kilograms. And that is part of our contribution in the world delivering according to the Paris Accord. Next slide. This is just numbers for those that perhaps not know the company that well. Around 2 million barrels of oil equivalents per day, equity, 20 billion in resources, adjusted earnings of $4.1 billion US, 38% of whatever we produce of barrels, regardless of oil, gas, the total production, 38% comes from international activity. So while the Norwegian production has kind of stayed flattish over the last 2 decades, we have grown from more or less 0 barrels internationally to around 750,000 barrels today. That is the size of Anadarko. So in many ways, we have grown internationally the size of Anadarko. I think the next wave internationally for us, a big change, is that we will become more and more operator ourselves. And you will see that from one of my latest slides. We are the second biggest provider of gas to Europe, and today we have windmills that are producing renewables to some 650,000 homes. And then the next slide shows you the key Statoil operated offshore projects, regardless of whether it's oil, gas, or wind. And perhaps we should start with New York then, since we're in New York. Empire Wind was the name of the offshore wind park that we are going to construct outside New York, starting producing and delivering electricity around 2024. we're talking about between 1,000 and 2,000 megawatts of electricity, and that can contribute in New York State's sort of ambition of 50% of electricity to come from renewables by 2030. So then in 2030, perhaps the light bulbs here will come from our windmills. Huh? So then if you go clockwise to Canada, we have discovered oil, East Coast Canada, outside Newfoundland. We are in the process of discussing kind of fiscal terms, and we need to know the fiscal terms before we can do the calculus of whether this project will fly or not. But I will show you some improvements when it comes to sort of the development cost and on the NCS that we have achieved over the last couple of years, and we see we get a lot of the same improvements when we now start working on these international projects. The next project is Johan Sverdrup, which is a world-class asset. Plateau peak production 660,000 barrels a day, and the emissions is 0.5 kilograms per barrel, and partly, or that is explained by this being electrified. So whatever you have a turbines offshore to generate power is coming from onshore electricity, and Norway is 90% electricity generation based on hydropower. Then Mariner, which is a heavy oil field, UK. This was discovered in the late 1980s. So why is it being developed now? Well, it was sanctioned when the oil price was higher. That's one. Two, we have more knowledge about heavy oil. And three, the technology today is different compared to what it was in the late 80s. Then we have offshore wind, also in UK, which is the world first floating offshore windmills, the Dudgeon. And we had a pilot windmill in 2009, and compared to that, we are seeing some 60 to 70% cost reductions in the development of Dudgeon, and this field was put in production, meaning delivering electricity, not many weeks ago. And this will deliver electricity to some 22,000 households in UK. If you then go to Tanzania, we have discovered 22 TCF of gas, which is a huge discovery of gas. And we are discussing with the host, with the government to establish a host government agreement. And then we have two assets in Brazil, Carcará, which is including what we were awarded Friday last week in the license round, the northern open acreage. This asset entails as much oil as the Johan Sverdrup on the Norwegian continental shelf. The difference is, of course, 100-meter water depth in Norway and more than 1,000 in Brazil. But still, it's a very, very good asset. Next slide just tells you that we are, when it comes to deep water, water depth deeper than 100 meters, around 300 feet, we are the largest operator in the world. And for us to deliver, good returns, but also behave from the point of view to deliver according to our own expectations, but also the expectations from the society when it comes to emissions and HSE in general. For us, it is about the tone from the top. It is about the people, the leadership, and the competency. And yes, we also learned from the Macondo accident in Gulf of Mexico some years ago. We have participated in the industry collaborations that came out of that, cap and containment, but also when it comes to emergency organizations. Actually, we had an exercise in Norway last week, a week long, a big exercise. And we pulled on resources from other companies to make this happen. So Statoil employees were a part of the ConocoPhillips emergency organization and vice versa. And when you visited the offices or the emergency rooms, you couldn't tell the difference. They were just executing according to the standard procedure of how to run and handle an emergency organization. And for international oil companies, that is comforting, because that means that they can tap into more resources if ever, God forbid, that you experience a really bad situation. Then on the cost side, it is fit for purpose. And we have achieved some stellar results that I will show you on the next slide. Partly because of our structural change internally when it comes to how to develop, and look at the developing resources, but also in close collaboration with suppliers, including R&D institutions. And also when it comes to drilling efficiency, we have seen some 69% reduction, 69% increase in number of meters drilled per day, and 42% reduction in number of days to drill a well. And this is, of course, of big importance, because that gives you some 30-40% cost reduction. So you're drilling actually more wells for less money. And when it comes to, you know that 30-40% of the development cost of an offshore development is wells, then this is really making a difference. I love Apple products. You know, my kids have Apple products, and it's really neat to go and visit an Apple store, even more so the one you have here in Manhattan. But the difference, you know, I'm an engineer background, and a lot of the stuff we do is as cool, actually. You know, sometimes it's even cooler, actually. But we don't have a shop like this to display it to you, huh? But what I find really, really interesting in this industry is not only the history of what we have been able to deliver on technologies. The first horizontal well successfully drilled and put into production was done on the Norwegian continental shelf in the late 80s. And without horizontal drilling, the shale revolution in the US would never have happened. We were also one of the first ones to capture and store CO2 at the Sleipner asset. This was in 1990s. And this is, of course, CO2 from the production stream. It's not CO2 from the emissions as such, which we're still struggling as a global society to sort of unlock that technology. And then the first floating windmill turbine, as I mentioned. But also we put in place the first world, ever subsea gas compressor a little bit more than a year ago. And it's been running for more than a year, like a clock. Ticked every day, no problems at all. And that has brought us to the belief that we actually can put a whole factory on a seabed instead of having a platform. Then you can put all the components on the seabed. That is what we're working on to be able to deliver on. And when it comes to the recovery rate, the world average is in the mid-30s for Statoil. Our ambition is 50%. And if you go to the right, you see that on Johan Sverdrup, our ambition is actually 70% recovery rate. And then go north. The 5 examples to the right is what to come in many ways. And I think when people are looking at the energy mix and the trends, the predictions going forward, it's so easy to look at sort of technology developments in all the new stuff, but tend to forget perhaps what the old industry, oil and gas, is able to deliver on. And the fully automatic drilling is one that will give us another 20%, we believe, cost reduction. And in addition, we will then not have people exposed to one of the most hazardous jobs offshore, actually. And hydrogen as part of the windmill. We have a collaboration with 2 companies regarding a gas-fired power plant in the Netherlands, where we'll try to pilot and see if we can convert this into hydrogen power plant instead, burning hydrogen. And if we're able to produce hydrogen at sort of commercial terms and use it for power generation, for just this power plant, we will save some 4 million tons of CO2 a year. And then it is my last slide, which is the next one. So when the oil price dropped, we had a portfolio of projects, 3.2 billion barrels equity to Statoil, that we would like to sort of sanction and put in, construct and put in production. And the 3.2 billion barrels then would be delivered to us equity over the years to come. So then 2.5 years ago, the break-even for development of those assets were $70 a barrel. We challenged the organization internally and said, we have to deliver at 50. And we were caught by surprise because, the organization over-delivered. So then it was down to 41, and now it's down to 27. And that's a totally different ballgame. And you might ask me, so how much of this is changed in the market conditions with the rig rates and everything else dropping? Internally, we have done some calculations, and we're saying between 15 and 20% of this is market dependent. The rest is just how we think, how we apply technology, and the structural changes that we have done and implemented internally over the last 2 years, which then gives us a reason to believe that offshore oil and gas is also offer a sort of a new wave of new opportunities. And by that, I say thank you.
So let me ask the panelists to come join me up on these comfortable bar stools, and we'll just kind of go right into a discussion. So I'll start with a follow-up question to you, Lars Christian. Thanks for that great overview, and then try to bring other people into the conversation. And I want to make it really conversational. We should talk to one another. If you want to come in on a topic, feel free to just jump in and do so, and then it's a good room and a good size group for bringing people in and having a conversation with the audience too. But I want to ask first about what you have done on the CapEx spending side to bring costs down. How remarkable some of the numbers we've seen from projects like Johan Sverdrup are. Just talk a little bit more so people understand how steep those reductions have been, and then what drives those. How much of that is structural versus cyclical? What are the factors that will push it in different directions moving forward? We've seen, for example, the surplus in drilling vessels, and when does that start to erode, and how does that potentially push up costs? And what are some of the other factors that when at some point, I suspect service companies will want to get a little bit of their pound of flesh back. What will that do to some of these projects? So what stays and what doesn't moving forward?
Well, what stays? I think in many ways that's up to us also, because we have had a discussion internally and said to ourselves, we would assume that there have been executive committees in this company and in this industry before us, whenever you had a downturn in the oil price, that have said never again, huh? That when the oil price comes up again, that you will sort of have that cost escalation or cost spiral. So what do we need to do this time then differently to avoid that from happening? And that's why we've been so extremely systematic in our approach, and we are saying around 20% of this is cyclical. 80% is for us actually to lose, either unconsciously or consciously, if you make a decision, deliberate.
Just so people understand the magnitude of the kind of declines we're talking about, just remind people sort of what you were able to do with a few of the projects.
Yeah, I mean, if you then bring it from 70 to 30, easy numbers, break even, then that's $40 reduction. And then, 20% of that means $8 on top of. So that will bring it then from 30 to 38 break even, roughly speaking. Huh? And that is extremely competitive, even in, a lower oil price environment than today's 60 or north of 60. So I think this is, about the attitude. This is about how we design. We design for the purpose of, what we need, not to build sort of extra slack into the facility. We are just designing for what we need. We are adapting and using technology in a different way. And this is also about how we, the contract strategy. For the bid process, how we run the projects when it comes to construction, how we follow up the yards. So it's a long list of nitty-gritty details, actually. And then, we shouldn't forget the drilling efficiency. We implemented a concept where we called it the perfect well. So we split every well section, nitty-gritty detailed, and looked through all our hundreds, thousands of wells, and said, for this specific job or this specific section, when did we, what was the best success, result we have to show for? And then we combined all those successes into one well and could define it as the perfect well. And that was the standard for every well from now on to be drilled according to. Sometimes you're not successful, but at least it led to an extremely push for efficiency. And efficiency is not on the expense of safety. Because if you have an incident, if you think HSE is expensive, then try an accident. Huh? But we have also been able to define new perfect wells based on improvements. So it's a lot of baby steps too.
And so you mentioned, just as a follow-up, the things that you have done as a company, you didn't mention yet, policy. fiscal terms? How important has that been to the improved economics you talked about? And then maybe Antoine wants to comment on that, or Amy, or Adrián.
Well, on the Norwegian continental shelf over these couple of years, we have not had any policy changes to help us out. Now that we work on the international portfolio, we have also seen a drop in the break-even over the last 2 years for those projects of $40, not down to 40, but by $40. And we're still not yet sanctioning them because we're not matured them to that stage yet. So we're still working to improve.
Antoine, when you look at the competitive economics of deep water around the world, what's your take on, not just, we're talking about sort of Statoil's projects, but when you look at the whole picture, what's happening broadly, how do you think about the competitiveness of the offshore and how that's been impacted by this oil price downturn, and what the outlook is moving forward, and how important those different factors are that Lars Christian talked about, or policy and fiscal terms?
Those are very specific questions. The only thing I would say, I would just take a step back. I think there was a perception until the price collapse that the development of the deep sea, deep water projects really had been associated with a run-up in prices, and that those projects were a very high cost. And when the price dropped, it seemed that there was questions about whether the shale industry would survive lower prices. But it seemed that Middle East production was low cost and would benefit from, would not have a hard time competing, but that deep water projects would be the first to go. And I think it's been a remarkable development, a real surprise, at least to me, maybe maybe not to others. But the turnaround of the industry, the ability of the companies to reduce their costs and to standardize equipment, to revisit their processes, to streamline without compromising safety, has been quite remarkable. At the same time, I think in the last few months, there's been a bit of a sea change about the future or the competitiveness of the shale oil industry. So if we look at the activity in M&A over the last 2 years, a lot of the M&A has been driven by the US, has been focused on the US market, and has been driven by the shale industry, particularly the Permian. If we look at 2016, every single quarter investment in M&A activity in the Permian went up dramatically, reached an incredible sky-high level at the end of 2016, early 2017. And then things came to a kind of a halt. And we're seeing now private equity turn its attention to Norway, to the North Sea, to deep water. So I think it's the story of Statoil, as you tell it, Lars, is remarkable, but it's beyond, it's not just about Statoil, it's about the industry as a whole.
So I take your admonition that my questions are too specific. Amy, your thoughts on this?
Well, I think, one of the sort of more specific point, and I can't speak to Statoil's business, I don't know what they're doing in this regard, but one of the things that's going to create a real rebound in offshore production is that the majors, many of them, have gone back in and thought about, say you had a production in Gulf of Mexico or in West Africa, and there was some satellite field or some extensions of that field that you weren't going to bother to do because you had some giant prospect you thought you were going to do up in the Arctic, or some mega project you thought you were going to do. Well, what people have really done with their budgets is, but it's part of what's brought the cost down, is they've canceled the real greenfield projects. And they've shifted to doing all these satellite extensions and enhancements of fields they already have, or something close to the infrastructure they already have. And so that immediately lowers costs. But the other thing it does, which I think is much more fundamental and gets to the market competition with OPEC, which is it shortens the time horizon for when you bring the production on. So if the majors did that in 2015, 2016, and in 2017, instead of having that oil come out in 10 years, that oil is going to be available in 2020, 2021. And so there are a lot of people who believed in the supply hole from the sort of 2019 to 2022 time frame, but deep water might be a very, forthcoming play in that time frame as everybody does their extensions.
You going to say something, Tom?
Just to weigh in a little bit on the policy point, because I do think, and the global tour of Statoil's sort of premier prospects was fascinating, including offshore wind locally here. And the high wind technology that's coming online off of Scotland is incredibly exciting. It was my hope it would have been Maine, but we know the story there. And one area that wasn't highlighted, though, is the Gulf of Mexico. And there's some really interesting things happening in the Gulf of Mexico on the U.S. side, but also offshore Mexico through the energy reforms. And a lot of thought being given to fiscal terms, not just royalty rates, but how bidding structure works and how diligence programs work. And I believe that's bringing front and center the need for the conversation in the U.S. Gulf of Mexico about as mature as that basin is, as well established as it is, as fantastic as the infrastructure is, and as reliable as the market is there. Is there a need for a conversation within U.S. government about the traditional fiscal terms offered in the Gulf of Mexico? And so policy and fiscal terms, as well as diligence and leasing programs, I think, have to be part of the conversation going forward for deep water. Redevelopment of fields and trying to get more out of fields through improved recovery and new drilling techniques is part of the answer, but eventually you have to branch out. You have to find new sources of supply to bring online, and what terms are going to apply to those ventures, I think, is going to be a really important part of the conversation.
And is your sense that that's happening now in the Interior Department?
The Interior Department currently has, without being overtly political about any of this, they're getting their feet under them. I think that they're quite interested in supporting and promoting offshore oil and gas, especially in the Gulf of Mexico, but opening access in other places, including the Alaskan Arctic and the Atlantic. But I think real thought and analysis needs to be given to the legal regime as well as the regulatory regime, and that's hard work. And it's the type of work that one can make mistakes with. As good as one's intentions might be, when you start messing with regulation, if you're not smart about it, if you're not analytical about it, and if you haven't engaged very closely with the industry on just how to do it, you can end up doing more harm than good and be counterproductive. And I think the Interior Department currently, with the new leadership, is still trying to get its arms around how to go about that.
You mentioned Mexico. I want to turn to that and bring Adrián in a second, but just to stay with you for a minute on the importance of policy change. So we have an administration that has very much emphasized a desire to bring new oil and gas resources to market, has pledged to redo the 5-year leasing plan, has talked about rolling back rules that they claim would boost production, like the well control rule for offshore production. Can you just help people understand what's the process one needs to go through to open up these new offshore resources? What's their ability to do that? And then what impact some of these regulatory changes might have on production, the production outlook?
So there's a statutory framework around opening new areas for leasing and then exploration for oil and gas resources, and it's very well established in the Outer Continental Shelf Lands Act, and it's very process heavy, and takes a number of years in which to do it. In the Obama administration, we completed 2 5-year plans. The statute requires that the Interior Department establish a leasing schedule during 5-year increments. The administration's made clear that they want to restart that 5-year program and that process in order to evaluate whether to open up areas that the Obama administration determined it was not going to offer for lease, including off of the Atlantic seaboard and off of my home state, Alaska, and the Arctic. That process will take some time. It'll take a period of years to implement. But part of what comes with it, I think, going to a little bit of the original point I was making, is it's not just about whether lease sales get placed on a calendar. Hypothetical lease sales get placed in 2020 or 2022. While that's part of it in terms of access, trying to understand what would be necessary and what would make sense to attract responsible oil and gas development in an entirely new area like the Atlantic. There had been some historical wildcat wells drilled there in the 80s. Geologists are, including my former staff, are very excited about it and want to know more, which you're not going to know without modern seismic surveys as well as exploration drilling. But what will it take, given that global portfolio that Lars described in his presentation, what would it take to actually draw capital into that area to do brand new field wellcats in a place like the Atlantic, let alone in the Alaskan Arctic? Near shore in the Beaufort, there's plenty of reason to believe that extensions off of current activity are viable economically as well as technically. But at the same time, those are major investments that have their own timelines associated with them, and how compatible is that type of activity with the current regulatory regimes that have very specific requirements over when you can shoot seismic and when you have to drill your first well and what your commitment to production has to be in order to maintain the lease. And rethinking some of that, including through legislation perhaps, I think is going to be necessary in order to keep deep water, especially offshore the United States, part of the conversation in light of all the other opportunities that are competing for capital globally.
Adrián, can you sort of comment on some of the things that have been said so far, and then I want to ask you about sort of specifically how you see the reforms playing out in Mexico. I think it's working.
Before actually saying a few words about Mexico,
can you pull the mic a little closer?
Before making some remarks about Mexico, I would like to ask the panel why, if all of these structural cost reductions can be reaped, as Statoil has shown to us in the North Sea, why is it that the situation in the U.S. part of the Gulf of Mexico continues to be so dismal? And the short-term outlook, at least, I'm not looking too far ahead, but the short-term outlook seems pretty bleak. So what explains that situation in the Gulf of Mexico, given this fundamental change, especially for deep and ultra-deep waters? This, of course, I'm interested in this not only because of the U.S. Gulf sector, but of the Mexican one, and to try to understand a bit better what are the real options for the development of deep and ultra-deep waters, and also some of the shallow waters in the Gulf of Mexico. Mexico is very active auctioning large blocks. Right now there's 2 auctions that are upcoming in the first quarter of next year, which is they are by far the largest, both in terms of the number of blocks and in terms of the number of the average size of those blocks. So, that's where my interest lies, and I'm trying to understand better what might be the outcome of these very large-scale auctions. Now, the companies there, and I'll move away from more of the technical stuff. I think that the real questions that today come up in Mexico are of a political nature. It's going to be, I think, very complicated in these upcoming auctions, navigating Mexican political waters. First of all, because we are having presidential elections in July of next year, and one of the leading candidates has very clearly not been supporting the energy reform in Mexico. Now, I don't believe that he will revert any of what has already happened by any means. I think that's out of the question. What I have doubts about is how he will go forward with respect to additional auctions. And that's been, I suspect, one of the reasons why the current government has been so actively, probably not very prudently, putting out for bids a large number of blocks, such a large number of blocks. So if that policy change takes place in Mexico, I think that is something that is a source of concern for many of the potential players in Mexico. But not only political conditions in Mexico itself, but the negotiations with the US under the NAFTA agreement. The US has proposed to NAFTA the elimination of the investor-state dispute settlement mechanism that provides for arbitrage in any of these disputes. That, of course, if it does happen, we don't know if it will happen, but up till now, that has been what the US side has been pushing for. If that does happen, it does pose additional problems to the participation of US companies, at least, in the coming Mexican auctions, the coming Mexican bids. But so, you know, it is very challenging, a political environment, both in the United States and Mexico, that will be affecting this process going forward.
Reactions to his question about sort of the outlook for the Gulf of Mexico? Did you have a comment, Lars Christian?
On this issue of policy changes, we have been following Mexico closely and have applied and been awarded blocks. We will look at you know, whatever comes next too. We have seen policy changes in Brazil. When the oil prices dropped, we were kind of following very closely whether some of the countries were tempted to tighten sort of the government take, but they haven't. We have mostly seen the opposite, actually, that they wanted to attract more foreign and direct investments in this downturn. Going forward, if you apply for an acreage in Mexico, get it, and if it's honored, then that is, you know, a good thing. Better than there will be changes for whatever comes next. At least then you know what you're up against, at least. But this issue of international arbitration, dispute settlements, we see also other countries pushing that envelope, not wanting to have it. And if you add a lot of other sort of geopolitical trends that we see lately, that is not good for a global, well-functioning economy that an oil and gas company is dependent on when you're taking in, making investments with a 30, 40, 50 years time horizon. So there's a lot of moving parts for the time being.
You mentioned Brazil, and when Statoil took part in the bid round that just happened there. I mean, there's been a lot of very large projections for what the pre-salt resource can do, and that's hit some bumps in the road as a result of politics and finance questions and corruption and regulatory local content requirements and other aspects. But I'm curious your reaction to the round that just happened and what sort of progress you think Brazil is making in helping achieve some of the ambitious targets that they have and others have for what production growth can look like there.
I think if you look at the underlying trend over the last couple of years, the policy changes have resulted in more foreign direct investments, more interest from international companies, definitely. They have opened up more acreage and also the possibility for IOCs other than Petrobras to be the operator. And all in all, I would say that they've been successful. You could always discuss whether there is a tweak here or there. There was one block that were not awarded in the last week's license round. Does that mean that it's a failure? I think many companies looked at this block as a block that has an extremely high content of CO2 and thereby not wanting to apply for it, I think. So there's a kind of natural reasons why it ended up not being applied for. So all in all, we see positive development in Brazil. And Brazil so far too have also been not only able to but also willing to address the corruption issue as a country. And I believe that when they come out of that cycle too, they will be more integrated in the global economy. And both Brazil as a country and Petrobras as a company will become an even more fierceful competitor in many ways. I think they will come out of this downturn as a stronger company and a country.
I want to bring in a couple other spots in the world I'm curious about, but on Mexico and Brazil, any comments on kind of what the outlook is and what the governments have done? Amy?
Let me just add this point on Mexico and the politics inside Mexico. I think that I understand the politics, and of course it's has its own momentum, and of course Mexico's been plagued by that to and fro of reform versus reform, reform versus reform, and the populism against it. The problem I see for Mexico and for Brazil, having discussed this with Petrobras over the last 5 years, is that up until 5 years ago, people have heard me talk about this, there was this belief or hope that we were moving towards depletion. And because we believed we were moving towards depletion, it meant that if you held your assets under the ground, the value of them would appreciate over time. You saw places like Kuwait where parliamentarians said they didn't want to let international companies come in and assist because they wanted to hold this oil because it'll be more valuable for future generations. Well, in a world where you're not actually sure about depletion, the timeline. Back in the day when I first started in the business, people were sure that depletion was going to happen in 2010. People used to say that. In OPEC, in 2010, and by 2010s, we're totally depletion of non-OPEC. So now that you're not sure because you have the shale and you have, other kinds of technologies, robotics, and things that are not only going to help the oil industry lower its cost, it's going to reduce the need for oil in different areas, maybe even in plastics through 3D printing. So when you look at these things, just at least the uncertainty, it means that there's a possibility that holding your asset under the ground means it's going to devalue over time, and that the country is going to permanently lose the value of those assets. Even if you don't believe they get stranded, you don't even have to believe in stranded assets. You just have to understand that oil under the ground is like a ticking resource, and the value of it will go down over time, either through technology identifying more and more resource at a lower level, at a lower price, or because demand will slip away over decades. So to me, when I hear a story like, fiscal terms, and I see countries, step back from whether their national oil companies should do it or whether they should wait, I think that there's actually a lot more pressure than people realize in terms of the necessity to have a plan that's a here and now plan. And you see Saudi Arabia and other countries responding to that understanding. And even Russia, responding to that understanding, and having these sort of short-term policies that are related to current revenue, but also long-term visions, right, for how they want to position their industry.
I entirely agree with you, Amy. I think the really fundamental change that has taken place, over the last 5-10 years, has been precisely that. The change in view from one of scarcity with respect to resources and one to abundance. So we've had this pendulum move, and today our perspective is totally different from what it was even 5 years ago. The question is if the pendulum moves again, because our own perspective about the future of the industry changes quite a bit also. And there's where I think, for example, the work that is being carried out by Antoine is very important, and that is, what are the consequences? Not of reaching peak demand, that's not a very, I don't think, useful exercise, but simply of accepting the possibility that demand will be growing much more slowly. in any industry, forget about oil, in any industry that faces a demand curve that, is gradually going to stop growing, it marks the whole industry. So I think that there's a lot of moving pieces in this that makes it very difficult to have a clear view of the future. This is always the case, but I think right now we're at an inflection point, both in terms of the view that we have with respect to scarcity and a view that we have with respect to the evolution of demand.
Yeah, which are two, I was going to ask, it seemed like there were two ideas there which are important to tease apart and not conflate, I think. One is that we've moved from scarcity to abundance. We've seen a price collapse over the last couple of years because so much new supply has been brought to the market. The shale revolution has been the primary driver of that, we have all this new supply coming at a time when demand growth is as strong as it's ever been. So we're talking about potentially peak oil demand at some point, but we're not there yet. And then the other question is, why are we talking about this at all, these multi-billion-dollar, long-term, multi-year investments in the face of a potential transition that means the demand curve looks very different? So I'm curious for people's thoughts on both of those, and also, Lars Christian, sort of how a company like Statoil thinks about those competing places to deploy capital in short-cycle sources of shale supply, for example, versus long-cycle, very costly projects offshore in the face of this dynamic where there's this new sources of supply and also these new questions about the demand outlook. Antoine, you were going to say something?
No, I mean, I was just going to agree with everyone. Everybody agrees with the others, so I was going to agree also. It's true that there's two components to this. There's a supply dimension and a demand dimension. So on the supply side, the hoteling rule that used to be the foundation of energy economics is now totally discredited. We understand that energy is not about resources, it's also about innovation. And when the prices call for it, we find the resource and the price goes down. But the concerns about long-term demand certainly are a new development. But ironically, I think in the end, they kind of work out in favor of big projects. Initially, it looked like, given the uncertainty, you would want to focus on short-term projects, like shale, where you have limited upfront investment, but quick payback and quick payoff. But in the end, a big project with a high upfront investment, but very low investment at the back end of the curve, just operating costs, makes a lot of sense if you have concerns about about long-term demand.
Which reinforces the sort of legal regime stability point. In order to bring these fields online, whether it's off of Brazil or off of Mexico, you need drilling programs in the short term. It's not just leasing, although there's been tremendous progress in a relatively short amount of time in terms of getting acreage into the hands of international operators with capacity, better capacity to develop the fields. But you need to have a regulatory program that will allow for those drilling programs to move forward in order to justify that longer term outlook that you're talking about.
Do you want to comment?
Yeah, I think one of the sort of factors on U.S. shale that has made it sort of complicated for everybody to really understand the dynamics around it is that it's not only about supply demand, it's also a property game. They have bought acreage with the purpose of trying to be bought by someone else at a higher price per acre. So we have an add-on when it comes to sort of the dynamic and price dynamics, and also thereby incentives to drill wells to keep, and thereby pushing more oil into the market, and thereby you saw kind of the contribution to the collapse. To your question, as a company, we think that that kind of projects in your portfolio that you can tune up and down on a short notice and get your capex back rather quickly is nice to have in your portfolio as part of the portfolio mix. Longevity, as you say, sometimes high capex upfront and then long cash flow is important to have. Sometimes it's kind of those projects that is hard to decide, make a decision upon. But when you have it in your portfolio, it's, that's what you really want to have, when you have the investments behind you. And then I think that you shouldn't forget that in 1991 was the last year that the world proved up more oil than it consumed. So every year since, we have consumed more oil than we have discovered. And that also needs to be factored into this, supply demand going forward. A lot of projects that were sanctioned just before the collapse of the oil price were projects that you had in the inventory as an industry, like the Mariner project for us that was discovered in 1987 and was decided a couple of years ago. So we tapped into resources that you had in the bank that were kind of very costly to develop, and then suddenly you had an oil price where it made sense, and now the oil price has dropped. So if you look at the inventory for of projects for many companies, it's not like it used to be either. So I think that is also why you see this drive from many companies to try to build up a better inventory of projects. And that's why you see the interest in Brazil, and you see the interest many other places. Last comment on the big projects. Big projects tend to become bigger. As you learn them to know, then you really figure out how to drive up a recovery factor. And so those are, really what you like to have in your portfolio.
Yeah, I just want to ask you as a follow-up, Amy brought up the concept of stranded assets. We did John Elkind hosted a panel last night on the future of international climate, whether the world's taking a 2-degree target seriously, whether it will do so at some point. And so a question that comes up a lot, and it comes up a lot in Norway, it did in the most recent election, was if we're taking those sorts of targets seriously, do we need to be bringing the new high cost, I guess maybe they're not high cost, but new complex and long-term sources of supply to market? That's a question that comes up often. How do you think about that as a company?
Well, we have discussed it, and for us, the answer is low on the development curve, low on the cost curve, and low on the carbon emission curve. Then you will prevail. If you're able to position yourself as a company that are able to deliver on those three factors, then you will prevail. Even in a world where you have a lot of renewables brought into the market, because everybody still believes that oil and gas will be part of the energy mix for many, many decades to come, then you will prevail. And that is what we're trying to do, to position ourselves as such a company.
And what do you see? I noted actually your CEO had an op-ed in Norwegian papers recently. I think the headline was from an oil company to an energy company, or if I may be getting the translation wrong. But that's something a lot of companies are thinking about, and you see companies looking at different forms of solar and wind and more of a shift from oil to gas, thinking about how to be resilient to a potential, maybe a transition that's faster than some people think, and there are also economic opportunities there. So what do you see as the outlook for offshore wind in particular, for Statoil? How much growth is there? How competitive do you see offshore wind today, and what was the decision to go into that business? Is it necessarily the case that a company that's really good at offshore oil and gas is also going to be good at offshore wind? That's just how it works? Or what was the thought process on going in that direction?
Well, of all the sort of different alternatives on renewables, we felt that was perhaps closest to our DNA. And it has proved to be so far too, that this is about how to run big projects, because it's several windmills. This is about part of the technology we have developed and have the property, intellectual property rights for some of the new technologies that we have brought on stream related to these windmills too. So we believe that this is something that we can master and can give us a kind of a decent return in range of 9, 10, 11%. And then recently we also entered into a solar project onshore in Brazil as a joint venture. And this is for us to sort of try to learn that industry too. We will never be a company that is in putting in place solar panels on a private house. That's not us. It needs to be big projects. It needs to be somewhere where our skill set can make a difference. We're trying to figure out, be part of this, learn it, and thereby gradually position ourselves in what we believe will be the future, and hopefully shape the future.
Amy, let me bring you in, and then I want to open it up to the audience.
So just to make one point, not to get the last word accidentally, but I think you have to look at it also from a shareholder perspective. A lot of the majors went into places that were very expensive. For gas, for example, in Australia, unclear how Tanzania could turn out, right? So you're developing these very expensive resources in the Sakhalin, in other places, and you're coming out with that production in the middle of a collapse because you miscalculated what innovation was going to mean in the oil and gas sector, much less what it might mean 10 years from now in the demand sector. So I think that when looking across the investment community, because Jason mentioned this question of stranded assets, when you look at the Norwegian pension fund, or you look at New York pension, New York teachers, or I was an advisor to the University of California, when you look at you're going to deploy your capital as an investor, are you concerned about deploying your capital with a company that is making a 20-year bet? You're going to spend 10 years doing something, and then you're going to want to produce it for 20 years. And you're having some cost framework, which if you did that in the 90s, you had some cost framework in mind, which is now, of course, completely incorrect, right? And so the revenue and the earning that those mega projects are going to get in some cases in Australia or in the Caspian, people are basically losing money, right? So, ultimately, I think that that's the question. Are companies completely assessing the risks of specific fields? I'm not saying that there's not going to be a giant amount of oil demand in 2025 or 2035. It's pretty hard to get rid of that demand, right? But the question is, in a competitive playing field, in 2030, there's going to be room for people, but there's not going to be room for everyone. And are you positioned, if I'm investing in one company versus another, right, and you're going to get access to capital, are you making the right choices for how you deploy that capital, given the risk of the 20-year time frame?
All right, let's open up to the audience. I think Julie is going to have a microphone. In the spirit of capital efficiency, I'm going to ask her to take that microphone and then ask Tommy and Adrián to share a microphone. We're being very efficient with our capital spending. Other questions? And if folks could just briefly introduce themselves, keep your questions brief.
Thank you. This is Akos Los with the Center, and I'd like to address this question mainly to Lars Christian, because you described some truly amazing cost declines across some of your projects, but I'm curious to what extent are these applicable across the deep water space? So what extent are these applicable to frontier areas like Guyana, to ultra deep water areas like Angola, or to gas-rich plays like those in Tanzania, for example? I'm also curious how much further room you think there is for additional cost declines, including through standardization. Thank you.
Well, we have seen a drop in the break-even for really deep water development, like the one I mentioned in Canada, the ones in Brazil, as well as in Tanzania, in the range of $40. And we're still working to bring it further down and not, come to the final investment decision yet. On the improvements going forward, so it's applicable around the world. I think it's more about how you approach it than whether it's one place or the other. Then we all know that physical terms are different from one place to the other, and that will also determine the break-even. Then on improvements going forward, standardization will give us further improvements, but also digitalization. Digitalization is not new, but the power behind it today, handling big data and all that kind of stuff is absolutely taking it to a totally different level. So in the case of Beaudreau development in Canada, we are thinking of using this to push digitalization to a new level for us, which means that there will be fewer workers offshore and you will do more work onshore from a center. We have a drilling sort of support center in Stavanger in Oslo that supports every drilling operation around the world globally for us 24/7. So this is the expert center that is assisting both in the planning and execution of wells. around the world. So there is more to come. I think one of the comments earlier was about, industry had cut costs and stopped project, and that is true. And I'm not sure, I don't have, we have been working hard internally and worked, hard with suppliers and also to a certain degree with some international oil companies. But to the degree that all the companies have done the same structural sort of cost efficiency program internally, that is kind of a question mark.
I visited the Schlumberger Research Lab at Cambridge University in England earlier this year, and what the kind of ways in which they're using big data, automation, digitalization is for deep water activity, among other activities, just extraordinary. Were there other questions? And there's a lot of expertise in this room, so if people who I know are experts don't weigh in, I might involuntarily bring people in. There's a question over here to the left. And
I'm wondering if we're not talking about the deep water in too homogenous of a way. Because, I think... Can you introduce yourself? My name is Bob Gold, and I should say that I do help run a private equity fund that does a lot of investing in deep water Gulf of Mexico. And so, we talk about the deep water, and you would think that, offshore Norway and offshore U.S. and offshore Mexico are the same. They're not. And I think people would be surprised, and I'm wondering if you agree, that at least according to Wood Mackenzie, the lowest cost barrel in North America, break even, is Gulf of Mexico Miocene. But one of the more expensive, to your question, why is the deep water suffering, is among the highest costs is Gulf of Mexico, lower tertiary, lower Wilcox, which is where you have the much bigger discoveries. And so isn't really the question not in a low price environment, will deep water survive, but where is the best place to do deep water? Because there's just some tremendous opportunity still, or I'm saying that as a question, but obviously I believe it because I'm investing in it. And do you agree? And one last point, as long as I got the microphone. $27 barrel break even is phenomenal, unless it's taking you 20 years between, or 10 years between first spudding and getting it on production. So in addition to a $27 break even, what kind of rate of return hurdle rates does Statoil aspire to?
Well, deep water is not deep water, so we agree. And then again, it's not only about the resource type, it's about fiscal regime that makes a difference. But also, is it a big asset or discovery, or is it medium or small one? And that's why I think it's really, really difficult to say that one place is much, much better than another place. Then again, I think there is one rule of thumb, and that is that prolific basins tend to be prolific still. So the best bet is to go where oil is already being discovered, definitely. On the return side, for this portfolio, we're talking about IRR north of 20. It's not bad.
over here? Yeah. Right next to John, I think. Right there, yeah.
Hi, my name is Evan. I'm a graduate student here at CEPA. I have a question for Statoil. So the Arctic is not as sexy as it used to be, but just recently it was announced that Statoil will come back to Arctic, I think next year. Could you talk a little bit about the profitability of Arctic? And I think Enei's break even for Goliath is anywhere from $50 to $95, and sort of what you see of in terms of opportunities.
Well, to build on what already was said, Arctic is not Arctic either. And then we had a drilling campaign this year in a region that some might call the Arctic, at least it was in the Barents Sea, north of Norway. Johan Castberg, which is a discovery we made a few years ago, was sanctioned this year, so it's now being constructed to put in production in a couple of years' time. So for us it is about, do you think you can make a business of it? And do you think you can do it in a prudent way, safeguarding the environment and withstanding kind of the test that we as a company are being put under? And that test every day is a huge expectation not only as to what we do, but how we're doing it. So every Norwegian is feeling that they own the company in many ways. Huh? So there's huge expectations, and that is pushing us when it comes to transparency. So we report, if you look at our financial reporting, you see that we report whatever comes of revenue from every country we are operating in. And that is pushing us to ultimately, develop assets to the best of our ability. Also when it comes to maintaining sort of safeguarding the environment. And if we can do that, then Arctic is, okay.
I just wanted to make a point about IRR. So IRR is a calculation you're making because you're going to calculate the life of the production, and built into that IRR is some premise about the oil price. So when Statoil does a 20% IRR for a field that's going to last the next 20 years, what price are you assuming?
I don't think he's going to answer that.
In a range.
Yeah, no, we're not usually announcing that kind of stuff. But I think, even if you used sort of the prices that you see in the market today, forward-looking, you would have a really good...
Those are very high prices.
Yeah, but we have...
Historically high prices.
Correct.
I mean, on a cost of a real price cost basis for the price of oil, the so-called, $18 or $20 price that we saw in the 80s translates into a $35 price today. So the question is, we're historically above that right now, and we, of course, in the 2000s were way above that, right? And the question is, what are the fundamentals that people believe in that's going to hold the price of oil way above, this long-term real price?
Yeah, and that is something that every administration needs to do themselves, when it comes to running their business. And then when you do that calculations, you also know that whatever you have of cash flow 20 years after in time, when you discount it back to today, it's, whether oil price is high or low, it really doesn't move that needle that much. Huh? So it is more the short and medium term price assumptions that really influences your calculations.
Samar can tell us if OPEC's going to stay the course. And whether I did want to, you brought up in the Arctic the questions of environmental safety, and Tommy, I wanted to ask you about that because it was a very heated debate when you were in the administration about Shell going into the Alaskan Arctic, about the safety regulations to lease those areas, and then I think on your way out the door, with roughly a month left, the president used a fairly obscure provision of the Outer Continental Shelf Leasing Act to permanently put much of the Alaskan Arctic off limits. Questions about whether that can be reversed, and maybe you can comment on that too. But your sense about whether, do you have confidence that the U.S. regulatory regime is where it needs to be to allow that activity to move forward if the market and the price, made that something companies wanted to do?
I think fundamentally with the Shale program, and there was a lot of controversy around it, but ultimately the geology was decisive, and the economics were decisive with respect to that program. And so the Arctic's not the Arctic, there's not one Arctic, but looking at some place like the Chukchi Sea, where Shell's program in 2015 was, it's hard to imagine in any sort of near medium term a large scale campaign in that area again. The current administration will look at reinitiating leasing there, and it'll be something they take a hard look at, I think. But the fact of the matter is, in 2008, industry spent $2.8 billion on leases in the Chukchi Sea. None of those leases exist anymore. They've all been relinquished back to the government. And in any sort of near or medium-term scenario, let alone a longer-term outlook, as everyone's described here, whether that is realistic or not, I think is really doubtful. Other places in the Alaskan Arctic, near shore Beaufort, are extensions of existing fields, and that can be it's been proven it can be developed in a safe and responsible way. And there's new production looking to come online in the Arctic Ocean off of Alaska, closer to Prudhoe Bay, under established technology. And so I do think there is an opportunity in the current administration to look at the standards that apply to those types of development in the Alaskan Arctic and right-size the regulation for the risks of particular types of development as opposed to a Shell-styled campaign that I don't think we're going to see again anytime soon.
Just a quick follow-up, and then I want to leave time for more questions. I don't know if I've quite asked you the question this way. 2010, a year into the administration, the Obama administration opens up many areas of the Arctic, the Atlantic, and the Eastern Gulf to drilling. And then on the way out, it puts permanently many of these areas off limits. What changed?
A number of things evolved during that period, I'll put it that way. The Obama administration never, to be technical about it, opened those areas and scheduled lease sales there. There was much more openness to consideration of leasing in places like the Atlantic and scheduling lease sales in the Arctic. The administration actually never executed on any of those sales. And so I think part of what evolved during the course of the administration was, one, Deepwater Horizon had an immediate and profound impact, including on President Obama. As someone who came into the administration to help deal with that crisis, I can tell you every step of the way, very hard questions were being asked of us in the Interior Department and his energy advisors on whether reforms following Deepwater Horizon have taken hold. And some of that Lars talked about in terms of subsea containment capacity and resource sharing across industry to respond to a significant incident. And that was part of the response back was, yeah, industry has really stepped up in a way that should give everyone confidence that this activity can proceed in a really safe way. With respect to opening new areas, part of what happens when you put areas on the table for conversation is the conversation takes off. And people who, taking the Atlantic, for example, thought about or advocated for or were focused on potential revenue coming from new leasing had to sit down and really talk with their constituents who ran commercial fishing operations or rented beach houses in North Carolina and had to confront those issues about how to reconcile the potential for oil and gas with existing activity and existing economic activity. And so that was a fascinating conversation that ultimately informed the Obama administration's decision-making with respect to a place like the Atlantic. And the new administration has reinitiated that conversation, but the terms of it have shifted significantly.
I thought you were going to say I left. But
once we got Bordoff out of there, it was like the gloves were off.
Okay, Samer, and then we'll go move the microphone back.
Samer from Saudi Petroleum. Thanks, Lars, for the display of Statoil, especially on the presentation itself. And the question goes, your integration story going forward. From an integration perspective, from a portfolio perspective, oil, gas, renewable, and then in the future, strategically, where do you see, and I'm looking at 20 years horizon. Some IOCs have signaled moving gas heavy. Some stick the course. So there is a mixed signal here, what the emissions and how that goes forward. I would appreciate your basically display on that. That's the first question. If I'm allowed for a second question, that would be one from that question is for Amy. As you mentioned something about you mentioned definitely the satellite that are existing wells that will come, of course, into play, and how effective those will fill in the gap in the next 5 years.
Well, It's a very good question. And if you go back 3-4 years and look at the IOCs when it comes to their strategy going forward, they're more or less the same. Small deviations, but a lot of similarities. If you do the same mapping today, it's all over the place. And it's kind of interesting because I think that means that not everybody will win in that competition or that race for the future unless you make some changes then as you move forward. But I think there will be some that are at least better positioned for the future than others. Our response has been renewables is something that we would like to tap into because we believe that we can play a role in it and make a difference and make a business of it and a return to the shareholders. On oil and gas, we updated our strategy last year. We called it not a real strategy update, but we called it a sharpened strategy. So it's more distinct, more directional than before, and more directional in the sense that we want longevity assets in a mixed with some asset that can return the capital really quickly, like the onshore. And then it is about really making assets compete on being low on the cost curve. Whether that is oil and or gas, you know. For us, I mean, we're game regardless in many ways, as long as you can make a very good business out of it.
So I've seen different numbers. I happen to like Gulf of Mexico in terms of having increased production. I think actually the potential is quite high for activity that's already taken place that's going to be coming online. So I've seen numbers for fields in non-OPEC, excluding shale, right? That but I do believe includes tar sands, right? Now that the Canadians have consolidated themselves and it's mostly Canadian companies, that you're talking about an addition to non-OPEC of 15 million barrels a day from these projects that were either green-lighted before the price went down or the kind of phenomenon I'm talking about where people are going to do these extensions and productivity improvements in their existing acreage. And so it's a pretty hefty outcome. But there's one wrinkle that people are not talking about, so I thought I'd just throw a bomb into the panel before we close. And I know we have one more question, which is that BP had a well that collapsed in Alaska because the permafrost is melting, right? So, and I know the Alaska pipeline was built in a certain way to keep it frozen, even if the permafrost itself is not frozen, like the prongs have their own internal system to keep the ground around the pipeline frozen. But, and the first initial reports were that BP's well was somehow unusual, right? But, you know, the oil industry has a tendency to say something's unusual, and then, you know, you do a little more investigation. So it happens that the state of Alaska now is asked the oil industry to do a full assessment of the casing and the integrity of all the wells. And I'm sure that in other parts of the Arctic, in Russia and other places, there are going to be similar problems. So although I'm very optimistic about non-OPEC, I'm not quite as optimistic as the panel about the Arctic, because I think there are going to be challenges that go beyond the fact that Shell had an almost accident in the Arctic that changed people's attitudes, perhaps even in the White House, about whether to go forward with these properties or not, and whether or not it'll only be private equity firms that would consider going to drill in Anwar, right? And will they have the depth of capital to pipeline it out, right? So it's very challenging to pipeline out from the Arctic, and the costs are going to go up as we have more and more melting, because part of the thing that keeps the cost down is people can bring trucks and equipment and so forth in the winter, right? So I think that the domain in the Arctic maybe is a little bit more in flux.
Yeah, a couple of comments. One being on having a total overview over the integrity of all your wells. that is really, really key, regardless of whether it's a producer, injector, or well shut in. Then on satellites being tied back into sort of a host platform, that has been a huge success on the Norwegian continental shelf. Not only that you bring in volumes that is kind of cheap to develop, but it also, you know, provides revenue from a tariff point of view to the host platform, meaning that that platform can run for more years and thereby produce from the original field for more years, and there you go, you increase your recovery factor. If you look around the world, I think many places you see some countries that have either licenses that expire that could, you know, be renegotiated and produce the asset produced for more years, and or do something about their production sharing agreement that incentivize more from a recovery point of view, increased oil recovery point of view, which definitely could also add barrels, which is just, you know, more examples of what Amy is describing.
So let's take the final two questions there, and then we'll give people a chance to respond, and then we'll wrap up.
Okay, I have a quick comment and then question. Natasha Densova-Sipa. Actually, about permafrost, Yamal has the same problems, and there are more and more you know, holes they're finding. They're not talking much about that, but that's a potential problem. I thought that what is missing from the discussion is geopolitics, because for Statoil, it makes a lot of sense to develop its backyard, and you always have been, you know, good in the offshore, and it's great. You're doing this, and in a way, it doesn't matter. Well, prices matter, but geopolitical stability and that's the fact that it's in your backyard maybe matter more. For U.S. capital, it's a question. If I have, right, I don't see a lot of appetite. I know we have an equity guy here, but besides that, I don't see a lot of appetite in capital from capital people to rush offshore, because you have shale on one hand, and you have this, you know, electric car revolution, if you want, coming on the other hand, on the other side. So basically, it's kind of like continuing with what Amy was saying. How long? I mean, I want my capital to work. Why would I go? Give me good reasons and good investment. Why would I go offshore at this point?
Okay, and we'll take one last question over here, and then get.
Hey, how you doing? My name's Anthony. I'm from Energy Intelligence. I was actually in Brazil last week for that auction, and Lars, I've been to your headquarters in Rio, and when you first walked in, you actually see one of the offshore wind turbines, not an oil platform, which is kind of interesting. My question is for you and Amy. You know, we hear about the synergies between, you know, some of these deep water operators and, you know, how they're used to working in the harsh environments, how, you know, those skills could be transferable to more offshore wind. And with regards to Amy, when I speak to the government officials down there, their feeling is they know they're in a transition and we have to get the oil out of the ground now, otherwise we're just going to lose all our value. So what are the real obstacles for at least, you know, deep water operators towards kind of breaking into that end of the renewable spectrum? Is it technological? You mentioned proprietary technology. And, you know, would we expect to see a little more aggressive behavior and kind of getting that even into your back pocket as something, given that the transition seems to be happening?
Comment on both of those quickly, and then.
Yeah, you know, the question of why invest in offshore. I think a break-even portfolio of 27 and return north of 20 is, you know, good. And we see that we can replicate a lot of, you know, good results elsewhere too, outside the Norwegian sort of backyard, as you allude to. On renewables, you see other IOCs taking positions. So I think you see this gradually catching attention. People are curious about what this is all about and what it's not all about. Sometimes when something is too good to be true, then it turns out to be too good to be true too. Whether that is the case here or not, I don't know. One thing on the renewable side is it's not a lot of places where people really are making money, at least not without subsidies. And then, will this trajectory going forward, growth-wise, be the one curve that we will see? I think we have underestimated it historically over the last couple of years, because the growth rates turned out to be much, much larger. Whether that will continue, well, if there is a bubble in the making, then most likely it's not going to continue. Then you will have a burst of that bubble, you will have a setback, and then you will have a lower trajectory going forward. What can make such a bubble burst? Governments not being willing or able to fund or subsidy, the too much capital being poured into this, so it's kind of overbidding. So you have seen some of these sort of bubbles historically in different industries. I'm not mentioning it because we strongly believe in it, but I think it's just one of the scenarios that a prudent company should look at as one of the possibilities when it comes to what you should do to position yourself in that competition.
So I mean, I agree 100%. So different companies are doing different things. And indeed, I would say among the majors, you even have some companies that are taking the position that if other people exit expensive oil, I can afford to stay in expensive oil. So as over time, maybe there'll be a gap, there'll be room for my expensive oil. But I think one of the challenges of that approach, but one of the challenges of investing is that because we're going into a deep innovation period between digitization, robotics, and 3D printing, right? And actually even new materials, we don't really know 100% what the winners are going to be. So you can praise Total for investing in batteries, but if Toyota has some solid state breakthrough battery that turns out to be the winner, or there's some new technology we don't even know yet, you have this problem of the leapfrog, right? And nobody wants to be, Nokia, so which was very fast and leading on cell phones, and then didn't go to smartphones fast enough. So that is what I really see as the challenge. I agree that you have a lot of institutional money that is committed to doing renewable energy, and therefore it's very hard to find the number of profitable opportunities that are going to reap this 7% return that people need for their, not to be investing, these billions and billions of dollars that have been supposedly promised to the renewable story. But the flip side is you have the customers, because you have, Fortune 500 companies. I think right now it's something like 65 or 70% of the companies in the Fortune 500 have made these major commitments, not only to renewables, but to reducing their greenhouse gas emissions. And so you have this sort of ready market, which in my opinion is a little bit bulletproof to the regulatory environment. In other words, you have the customer. And this administration or some other administration, or there could be some flip-flop in Europe, but in the end, you have some private sector players and then their customers wanting to go in a certain direction. And I've written this down on a piece of paper, and it seems really against the grain, but I personally think that a carbon price is inevitable, right? And we're already paying a shadow price for carbon. A lot of corporations in the United States and most of the oil companies all use the carbon price in projecting their forward capital. And when you have so much part of the economy using a carbon price and projecting its investment, the idea that somehow a carbon price would cost the consumer something seems remote, because the consumer's already paying for that shadow price that's going into people's investment calculation. So I personally think that once we have a rational market where these things are captured in a carbon price, and you get out some of the anomalies, like you can have a master limited partnership for oil and gas, but you can't have a master limited partnership for the production of renewables energy. When some of those things get corrected, which I think they will, then I think it'll be easier to see the investment go in that direction.
Okay, on that optimistic note of a rational energy policy, moving forward, So just say in conclusion, on behalf of the Center on Global Energy Policy and the New York Energy Forum, thanks all for joining us here tonight. As I mentioned, a full video recording of the event will be available on our website in a few days, and you can subscribe to the podcast series of our events as well on iTunes or Stitcher or SoundCloud or any number of other podcast platforms. We have too many events coming up to mention all of them. I'll just mention one. John Elkind, who's here now, the former Assistant Secretary of Energy, has put a series together about what's next on climate. Last night we talked about what's next with international climate negotiations in the wake of the U.S. withdrawal. And next, on November 9th, we'll talk about U.S.-China energy and climate cooperation in the Xi-Trump era with many panelists, including John and our own fellow David Sandalo and Dave Rank, who some of you may recognize the name because he resigned as charge d'affaires at the U.S. Embassy in Beijing to protest Trump's withdrawal from the Paris Agreement. That will be at 9:30 in the morning on November 9th. Please join us. And please join me in thanking our panel.